Good morning and welcome to the QuickBooks Online webinar presented by Rockus CPAs and Advisors, Small Business Accounting Principal Mary Ellen Michaelson. Before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping tips. All attendees are in listen-only mode. There is a chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to enter questions there and we'll address them all at the end of the session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to all registered attendees in the next few days as well. Now that we have that out of the way, let me introduce today's presenter. Mary Ellen has been with Rockus CPAs and Advisors for over 20 years. She's a certified public accountant and has significant experience with QuickBooks. Throughout her years with the firm and as a head of the small business accounting department, she has helped numerous small businesses improve their efficiencies through QuickBooks implementations and payroll processes. Now, before I spend all of your time bragging about her, I'll hand the mic off to Mary Ellen.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to say, we're all here to discuss the QuickBooks general guidelines. There is a little bit of housekeeping items I'd like to discuss. Right now, I'll be using a sample company. That's what you see on your screen. That's what I'm sharing. The PowerPoint presentation that you received in an email is the guide that we're using, but we are not going to be flipping back and forth to that. We are going to actually be walking through the QuickBooks online version to go through the topics that we're going to be discussing in the presentation. And so I just wanted to mention that, there are a few things that we wanted to go through, some month-end procedures, some planning and budgeting, and some tips and tricks. Now, the planning and budgeting is for plus and advanced versions. So if you don't have that, maybe that's something to consider if you're looking at doing some planning and budgeting. There is a lot of items that are involved in QuickBooks Online. And so we just wanted to grab these few areas, thought there was some good things, and hopefully you pick up a little bit of knowledge that maybe you don't have, or areas that you might want to look further into exploring. So within the month-end procedures, we wanted to discuss like the bank and credit card reconciliation, some undeposited funds transactions, voiding checks, journal entries, and you see the list in your PowerPoint presentation. But what we want to make sure is that using QuickBooks, the proper setup and utilization are important so that you have great success in the software. And so therefore, we are going to begin with banking. And what we do is there's different ways you can actually find how to get to the banking and different ways to do a variety of tasks within the QuickBooks Online. So I'm just going to use the one that is most familiar to me. Maybe there's another way that you get to some of these items. And throughout, I might share that there's couple different ways to get to things. There is this area over here that has a variety of tasks that people, quick tasks that you can get to versus using the drop-down menus on the left. Also, there is the gear icon over here that you can get to a few different tasks as well, mainly some company items and things we'll get into later. But in starting with the banking section, this is the way I get to the banking. And you can see that when we're in the banking section, we have the accounts that are linked to are considered our checking or banking areas. And this shows, the blue on the top shows like the actual bank balance from the most recent time that you downloaded the transactions through the QuickBooks. The bottom actually shows the QuickBooks balance. So you can see there's a difference, but obviously there is a difference based on the information that's in your checking account at the bank and the information that's actually in your QuickBooks. So there are differences. Now, one thing to note is that when you link your bank account to QuickBooks, it tends to be a little easier and also could be more accurate with the information download because that's what went through the checking account. But one thing to note is you want to make sure that you watch out for duplicate entries, and we'll discuss that a little bit, but sometimes that occurs when you're downloading your checking account and then you download your credit card transaction, and you might have some duplicate transactions when you do both of that. So please be careful of duplicate transactions. They can be removed and excluded and deleted. But the first thing is that if you haven't linked your bank account to your QuickBooks Online, you would want to do that here through the linking account. And once you set this up, the information that you need is a step-through process. This sample company, we really can't do that with, but all it asks for is your financial institution name. There's a online ID and a passcode that you would get, but in discussing with your bank the information, that you'll be able to easily enter that information and link the accounts. Then you actually choose the account that you want to link, and once that's done, it is connected, and in doing so, you receive the report that you see on screen that shows that you have some transactions that you might want to add to your QuickBooks account that are matched already with a QuickBooks account, or that have two records that are found that might match. So, and this is for your review. There's 25. Again, this is a sample. There's none that are categorized, and we'll discuss a way to easily set up some rules so that you can then categorize them automatically, and then you do not have to do this formal review. They will automatically go and get categorized for you. But let's just go over what some of these items on the right-hand side call for. If it says add, you want to be careful that you don't add a transaction that might end up being a duplicate transaction, because you have it recorded here. You may have had it recorded already in a previous bank reconciliation, or possibly through a credit card transaction, and you then recorded it also through the bank account. So these adds are things that you might want to investigate further. And you can always click on one of these transactions to see and go to the actual transaction and decide what you want to do with it. But if it's a match, that means that you have a transaction already in QuickBooks, and that when it downloaded from the bank, there is also a match, or a downloaded transaction, so the two of them match. So once you click the match, you will then see, if you go to categorized, that you now have a matched transaction. It's now recorded in your QuickBooks file. These 4 review entries are not recorded, potentially are not recorded in your QuickBooks file, because it's a temporary location type of transaction, if you would. But then you, currently we have no excluded transactions. If one of these added transactions was a duplicate transaction, we could click on it and we could exclude the transaction instead of adding them. We could always exclude transactions, and that's what you might want to do. Maybe if you have these 2 records found and they don't all match, there could be, see, you can go to the transaction itself. If you have this record found, you know, there's different things you can do here to make sure that you get the information within QuickBooks. Also, once in the categorized transaction, you can still go to the actual entry and make any changes that you need to. Doesn't mean that you can't change it. You can also undo the transaction as well. And then when you're in this field screen here, you want to see different things. Maybe you want to see the check number. You can modify the screen itself by turning on the check numbers. You can also change and add different transaction details here, or also the amount of transactions that are listed. So that's what gives you the opportunity to modify your screen. And the reason you want to make sure that you categorize these transactions properly is to make the bank reconciliation easier. Now, one thing that we want to discuss, so we've gone through this area here where you've linked an account, you have your transactions. Here you have two checks, two records that are found on November 19th. This one we want to say matches, but for some reason the other one on November 19th, now I lost it now. It was on November 19th. We categorized it November 19th. It was $75. I wanted to exclude it from the transaction to show you what that happened, but it's not letting me find that transaction again. But here's where you can then exclude this transaction. So now we have an excluded transaction, this books by Bessie. We excluded it. And if you then want to delete it from here, you can delete this transaction if you know that it is a transaction that you do not want in your QuickBooks, and you would want to clean this up and keep this clean so that you don't accidentally undo these transactions and put them back in. So you could easily delete the transaction. Now this sample company that I'm in, everything that I'm doing is new, and you can play around with it and see what things are you can do with it so that your learning process, if you would, or try different things. But the one thing to make this easier, when we go here and we see this description, we say a rental, there's multiple transactions here. There's Hicks Hardware, there's a few transactions. You could set up rules so that once you download the transactions into QuickBooks, it will automatically categorize them for you so that you don't have to go line by line and select the expense, select it, make sure it matches. So what you do is you can go here to rules. We have no rules set up, so we can create a rule. We can call it whatever we'd like here. So if we just call it a rental, just for ease of renting, and we want it to check every bank account that we have. You can have options of not having them all and maybe just one, if you know for sure that you have those transactions in only one account. And so there's different drop downs here that you can include. We want to say in the description it contains a rental, and we want to, this is an expense, we want to make sure it goes into an expense. And then we, I know there's an equipment rental in here. We want to say it's an equipment rental, so it automatically goes to that account. You can select a payee, or you don't have to. So we can leave that blank. And then tags are different ways you can categorize your transactions that mean something to you in reporting and other functions like that. So that, but that's something that we're not going to enter at this point. So then we have this rule. So then when we go back here to the banking, we now see that a rental has been added automatically to our categorized transactions. We don't have to then manually enter those transactions. So you could have any number of rules set up. So once you download the bank transactions, they automatically get categorized, and there's then less items here for your review to make your day-to-day transactions easier. So that is the rules that we have, and you can go ahead and make a fair number of rules. There's, like I said, different places to see where the rules are located. Now let's go to reconciling our bank account, and that's one of these items that we do over here in the gear. Again, this is a sample, so there's a lot of little notes that are going to come up. But we have our checking account here. If we say that the ending balance is $1,000 and our ending date is today. Of course, you get your bank statement and you'll make sure that it all is from the statement itself. And in the statement, you'll see that there's all the payments. And here again, you can modify what you see as far as making it compact, ultra compact, regular, what items you want to include for the columns to modify to your likes and dislikes for the presentation purposes. And you have different transactions that you might want to include and not include. So you go through until your balance, and obviously I just entered a balance statement amount, but you go through until your balance matches, and there is no difference here. When you're looking through all your transactions that you have, and the statement itself and the bank account. Now, if you get interrupted and you want to finish later, you can then save it for later. It will stay exactly where you had it. Maybe you think you messed up everything and you want to start all over. You can then close without saving. The one thing that I wouldn't advise you to do is, especially with a large balance like this, to finish now. So if we changed our balance, so maybe it was higher, we have a lower balance. If we make it match just by with the transactions I have, oops, I guess I didn't quite do that, the correct balance. So now I have a zero balance, and now I have a check mark, and my options are still the same, but the one that comes up is finish now. So if I finish now, then I'm done with that reconciliation, and I can then start the next month's reconciliation. There's also reports that you might want to, and one thing to note is, I guess I skipped over this, is what account do you want to reconcile? You have to select that account. You can choose your savings account. You can have different accounts that you reconcile. Typically, it's your bank accounts and your credit card accounts that you do reconcile. There is a report that you can get when you're done, and when you're looking at the banking information, you have your bank balance reports. And we'll go through some of these reports later. I missed the reports. But the report that you get is actually, and that's why I'm not sure why I didn't get my report, is the report is a static. I wanted to mention it's a static report, and if you go and change the bank balance and you modify it through after that, then that report does not change. It's like a PDF snapshot of that bank balance. So now we've gone through some of the banking features. We've linked your bank account. We've set up some rules. You've matched records. You've decided, and here you can change if you want it uncategorized, you want to go directly to a specific account right away. You can do that and then add it. So there's those different transactions. Also, one thing to note is you had this, we made this rule and you can see that the rules were used. I wanted to note that so that you know that when your rule is correct and it's being used, or if you're doing it manually. So then let's look at some month-end items like the, sorry, wrong spot. You never know where things are because of the two different sections. But when we look at, we've done the checking, and you can reconcile the savings account the same way. You can download transactions there as well. But the one account that we do want to go over is this undeposited funds account, because it sometimes can cause issues with transactions and the balances and where you have information. Now, this account is used when you receive customer payments and you create an invoice and you receive payments against that invoice. You then can have the option of making that payment to this undeposited funds account. And why would you do that? You would do that, and we can go to the sales receipt and show you. Specifically, instead of selecting a checking account, they selected undeposited funds account. So that way, when you go to the bank, you have multiple bank deposits for one day. Maybe you have 6 or 8 of them, or just 2. You go to the bank records all those transactions, and on your bank statement, there's one line item. When you go to reconcile, then you'd have one line item if you group them into these undeposited funds. So you record all of your payments from your invoices to undeposited funds, then you create the bank deposit and you include all those specific deposits. The transaction is that those funds temporarily are held in this account. So it's a holding account for those deposits until you go to the bank, because maybe you collect deposits and you only go to the bank once a week. So then you make those transactions throughout the week. They all get gathered here, and then you make one big deposit. But what happens if you have a negative account? And so I created this because this is a sample account, but we have now, we don't have a deposit for this, but this is a negative. Our balance is actually negative in this account. And so how do we clear this transaction from this account? The way that you would clear it is that you would create a journal entry. And I believe the date was November 19th. We're going to create the journal entry so that we go to an expense account. And I'm just going to select one here. And the amount was $100. And maybe there was I always suggest that you put in some sort of trail so you know how, or the reason that you are doing the journal entry. So you want to make sure that you're doing it as a proper transaction. And so then, oh, okay, so I must have recorded the first one incorrectly. Let's reverse these. So then we want to make a deposit. And so we want to select both of these transactions. And in doing so, we actually create what's called a zero bank deposit. Because then one is a debit transaction, one's a credit transaction to undeposited funds, and it will clear the account out. So if I save it, and I go back to my undeposited funds account, I then have both of these, and they're both reconciled out. They've both been included in a deposit slip. So then my balance would then be zero after those transactions instead of negative. So then but does everybody, if we have the banking and we have to make a deposit, obviously these are our deposits that we have outstanding. They were both on the same day. If we select both of them, we're going to go to the bank. It's going to be $2,000. If for some reason we want to wait and add more, we wouldn't select them and we would wait until another day. Now, what happens when we're going through, and so then that gives us our information to our bank account reconciliation as well. But what happens if we are going to our we're going into our checking account and we want to find a check, and for some reason this check, we want to avoid the transaction. We have to ask ourselves, when do we want to avoid this transaction? Where exactly are we sitting? Have we prepared the year end? This transaction was dated in September 30th. Maybe we reconciled the statement, we realize there's two of them, and we want to void this transaction. In doing so, it might be October or November when we do this. That's fine. We can then go down here and click on void. And then if we see that this now, go back to it, it now will say voided the payment status. That's fine. But if we didn't want to void the transaction, but instead, we just created it maybe, and we can delete the transaction here. If we are sitting, and this is was a November 30th transaction, but we're now sitting in March or April of the following year, and our accounts have all been reconciled. We've created our bank account, our tax return, and instead of voiding the transaction, we wouldn't have wanted to void that transaction. So let's take, we would want, oops, I keep going to that one. This one here, the $62 in October, instead of voiding this one because we're sitting too late, it's maybe 6 to 9 months later, everything's been reconciled, we would want to create a journal entry. So this is $62 on November 15th. And so we would want to put the money back into our account. So we would say 6201. And here again, we want to make sure we're including all the details to void Chin's check that was rewritten because they lost it. And I don't know what expense this was to, but let's go to equipment expense. But again, here, and you could include the check number, you could include the date, it was October 15th. But we want to make sure that when we void this this transaction is being voided, we are saying it is the following fiscal year, because we do not want to adjust it in a previous year, because once you void that transaction, it will remove everything. This way, you now have an offsetting transaction to that 6201. This is our offsetting transaction to our original entry here, 6201. So we have this transaction, we have this transaction. When we go to the bank reconciliation, we would then see both of those transactions. We would select them both, and they would offset, and it would essentially void the original transaction that we had, this October 5th check number 5 transaction. And as you saw, we went and we created some journal entries already. We went and created, we have to select the specific date. You enter some accounts in here. If you want to go to checking, again, you want to make sure you enter as much description as you need to. If you then have an expense account you want to go to, you can go to expense accounts. You can go to accounts receivable. If you select an accounts receivable account, you want to make sure that you're selecting a name. We want to make sure that if you're going to select an accounts receivable account, you come down here and you select a customer name. So that way it gets matched up with that customer, so the records on that customer are correct. Also, when you're selecting an accounts payable account, if this is the only way that you can do these transactions, sometimes it is, here again, you want to make sure you're selecting a specific vendor so that you match them up. But let's just use, instead of having those, let's just use an expense account. Now, if this is an account that we're recording because it's the end of the year, we need to record it for reporting purposes as such. And we want to save the transaction. But what happens if we want to then, since we made this transaction December 31st, for some reason, we've already booked that transaction in our QuickBooks January, but for reporting purposes, for financials or tax return purposes, they wanted us to have that booked in the previous year. We might want to reverse this transaction. But as you saw, you have to actually save the transaction, then you could reverse this transaction. And when you reverse it, it reversed the transaction. My checking became a credit. My advertising became a debit. They gave me the next business day. And then as well, there's an R after the transaction journal entry number if you needed to find that transaction. Now, also, just to note that if you click on this little clock thing, it gives you the most recent transactions that you have. If we went to one of these other transactions that we have recorded, right, there is this make recurring transaction. So these appear because I've recorded and saved the transaction. I could copy this entry. If I do that, I have the exact copy of it. I could delete it. I could see the transaction journal. Again, it's not going to give me much because it's the same transaction, just like the journal entry, just like the actual entry itself. But I could make this a recurring entry. And if I make this a recurring entry, what it asks me is, what do I want to name this recurring entry? So maybe I have a rental entry every month and I don't want to have to record it every month. I can include some information here. How often do I want to record it? When do I want to record it? How, and if it's monthly, the first day of the month, is it every month or is it every 2 months? You can put, whatever you want here. The start date could be the following year. And then you could have an end date as a specific how many occurrences you want. Maybe you want to do it for 12 occurrences. Maybe you want to do it by a specific date. So there's different options here as to how you want to save this entry. And if you do that, this one, I have it scheduled, or you can have it as a reminder. The reminder means that it will come up as a reminder, and then you need to make sure that you're selecting those, or unscheduled where you actually have to pull them up from the list and do them manually. But if you say scheduled, it will automatically submit them. So as you can see, a reminder changes it slightly as far as what information. Unscheduled, it just is going to put this into the list of memorized transactions, and you have to actually go and pull that memorized transaction up. So if we go over to our list of recurring transactions, I call it memorized because in QuickBooks Desktop they call it memorized as well. But here it's recurring transactions. We have a couple scheduled transactions already, and so we can see what they look like, and the dollar amounts are in here. The one thing that we like to do with these is we like to make recurring transactions for depreciation entries that your accountant might give you on a monthly basis, or also payroll entries. And if you do entries and you do a payroll entry, obviously this is a simple, as you can see, it's a bill, it's a recurring bill. You could have journal entries, bills, invoices, any number of things in QuickBooks you can have as a recurring entry. But if you make a journal entry as a recurring entry for payroll, you can have everything in there and put in a dollar as the amounts and just change it when you receive the payroll reporting purposes. So now we've gone through journal entries, we've gone through the banking. The one thing I want to look at is we have a balance sheet that we try to make sure we go through and make sure that on a monthly basis we're reconciling or validating, if you would, the accounts to make sure that they're accurate. Because if they're not accurate going forward, we want that in 1 month, then going forward the balance will continually be off. So we've discussed like the checking and the savings account. Our accounts receivable, you can get an aging report, and we'll kind of go through some of these reports later. But you can get an accounts receivable aging report, and you could go through and see if all of this makes sense. And if not, you may have to do some journal entries to reconcile those, some adjustments, discounts, credit memos. But each account on the balance sheet should be what you want to look at. So you want to look at to make sure you go down the list and that you're going through and you're reconciling the accounts. Bank accounts with the bringing in the accounts through banking, linking them, matching them, reconciling the accounts, and that will validate that that account is correct. Our accounts receivable, going and looking at an accounts receivable aging summary and going through the customers, and then if we need to, doing any journal entries or writing off any credit memos or things of discounts to clean those accounts up. We have journal entries for any depreciation expense we might have. When we do look at the liability section, again, we have the credit cards, which we can do a reconciliation of the credit cards. You can link those As you saw through the banking, we had a MasterCard that we linked, and we can link that and see the same type of transactions that we have for the banking section. But so we want to, one thing to think about is you want to make sure you go through this and see what accounts you have and what types of things that you have questions on. And as you know, QuickBooks has a wide range of reports to run. They give you some areas of that they categorize the reports with, as far as business overview reports. And if you just click on them, obviously you run the report, but you can also customize them as to the date and time, what type of method you're using. But over onto the right-hand side, you can have some customized report information. And here again, it's the same dates and what type of accounting method, but you have some filters that you could run it by depending on what specifically you're looking at. If you're trying to figure out what vendors, maybe you have specific vendors you want to include on the account balance sheet report. But then you also have these headers and footers. You can change the way the report looks, all kinds of things. But once you make any modifications you have here, with specific dates, range, you want to make sure you run the report. And the same with up here, if you change anything up here, you want to make sure you run the report so that it changes and modifies your report versus leaving it the same. If I change something here and I don't click run, it doesn't actually modify the report. But once I click run, it modifies the report. Then once you have the reports to your liking, and you can do this in all of them, you can save this customization. And when you save this customization, you can name the report a specific report. And if you have groups, you can add them to groups. You can create a group name. And so we're going to just create this group name. You can share it with people. And the one thing to note is when you share it with people, it doesn't have to, the person that you're sharing it with, they do not have to have QuickBooks in order to be able to share the report. We're not going to share we're not going to list anybody here, but so when we save this report and we go back to all of our report list, we go to our custom reports, we have this sample balance sheet detail report that we just created. And so then we can pull it up at any point in time. The standard reports, if you click on these boxes, they'll add it to your favorites. So if you have a report that is way down here, maybe it's the general ledger report that you always have to scroll down to get. If you click on that little star, it will create the report up at the top. And so then you don't have to keep scrolling down. Again, if you like the report, they pull it up always in a month as a monthly report. You can always change it to this year, save it, and call it yearly general ledger, and then it will show up in that customized report section. So then we've gone through some of the accounts on the balance sheet. We've gone through banking. We've gone through some reporting purposes and how to create those reports. But the one thing that sometimes it happens is, and we talked about year ends and going over different years, we might want to be concerned with the timing. And in QuickBooks, we can always make changes at any point in time. I could make a change now. This seems to, the sample company seems to be all in 2020, but I could create dates and transactions for 2019 that would change some of my 2020 balances. Would I want to do that? No. Can I stop people, myself, and others from doing that? Yes. And the way you can do that is you can do that by setting a closing date. And when we set that closing date, when we set this closing date here, we have these account usage type of things. We go to advanced and we see close the books. Well, it's marked as off. So that means we can create any transactions for any time that we want in this book, in this QuickBooks. This is the beginning of the year, is January. And so if we click this on, now we have January, we have a fiscal year. We're on accrual basis. When do we want to close the books? Well, if we're sitting in 2020, we don't want to close the books as to 2020, but we might want to have them closed through December of 2019 so that nobody can make any changes into a previous year. Now here you have a couple different options here. You can allow the changes after viewing a warning. So you could make a transaction, a check, a journal entry, a bill, anything like that, and you could then just get a warning, or you can have it so that you enter a password. So once you enter a password, you'd have to enter that password in order to make the transaction happen. So let's just enter a transaction or a password here. And so I closed my books as of December 31st, 2019. I then, I'm constantly doing this. I'm then going to create a journal entry and I'm going to date it December 31st, 19. And you can get all the way through the transaction. And when you go to save, it says this transaction was on or before your company's closing books. Using this date will affect your books. So it's giving you a reminder. If you didn't set a password, you could just hit, it'll ask you, do you want to continue? You could just hit yes or no. But because I entered a password, I have to enter that password in order for it to continue. And now it saved my transaction. But this makes you think, do I really want to do that? Sometimes I suggest that people create a password that they're not going to remember in order to make that change, because otherwise what will happen later is that they'll just use it as a default and they won't think about that. So we've gone through some of the month-end close items. We've looked at all the balance sheet accounts and things in nature. Let's just spend a little time on planning and budgeting. And as I mentioned, planning and budgeting is only available in the Plus and Advanced versions. And so when you have the budgeting, there is a few things that you might want to consider doing, and we're just going to create a budget. This is, being a sample company doesn't always have a budget created. So we're just going to create, and as you can see, it just lists out your income accounts throughout and expense accounts that you have in your chart of accounts. You select when you want to create this budget. And so we have, or from what fiscal year information you want to create the budget. We know that 2019 didn't have anything, so we're going to create it in 2020. How often do we want it to pre-fill data? Well, I guess we create what year we want. Now, I just want to do it monthly for now. If we didn't want it to pre-fill data, we could leave it as such. But if we want to use actual data from 2020, we could do that as well. And you have the options of subdividing or using a specific customer. Maybe you want to run a budget by a specific job or customer. You have that option as well. But this sample file doesn't have so much, so we'll leave it as this information here. And so you can see, scrolling down, there is some information listed in here. And so this is just the budget review. We actually have to create the budget to continue. And so then we're creating here, we can type in a dollar amount. And if we click on this, it will copy the dollar amount all the way across. You can also change various amounts throughout afterwards. I mean, there's different things that you can modify. You can, again, modify if you want it by the quarter or year, hide blank rows. But when you're creating your budget, you probably don't want to hide blank rows unless you're done or you realize you're not really going to be using those specific accounts. Then we have, we want to save the budget before we can do anything further with the budget. So this is our sample budget, and we can then open it up and edit dollar amounts in here if we want. Oops, got to get rid of things that are in there first and save it all over again. But if we want to look at, we can copy this if we want to, if we created a sample and we want to modify it slightly to see different, maybe different versions of that budget. We want to change specific expense counts or categories within our budget, or just the income and not the expenses, to see how that flows out, or you know, the results are. But then we can run some reports here. There's a few, as I mentioned, a few different ways you can do things. You can run the budgets and actual reports from here. And so you can see our actual versus our budgeted amounts. Obviously, because this is a sample company, there's not a lot of detail, but you can see that you can have, you know, the full year report here shows everything. And again, we have the same options. We can customize it. We can then add things and modify the report. Or we can go here to reports, and we have our budget overview and our budget versus actual within the reports as well. So there's different places to look for the budget. Now on to, so we've kind of gone through that section of the material. And so then I thought I would just throw in, before we go to tips and tricks, I wanted to mention one item that I think is pertinent to this time of year, is the fact that we have 1099s and they will need to be reported in the next year. And the IRS has come out with a new form, a 1099 miscellaneous or 1099 NEC form. And because we have, if you have, see, I clicked too much. Sometimes when you click too much, you have contractors and you need to issue 1099s. Which ones do we need to issue them to? If we go here to contractors, we see that there's only one that we have as a 1099 vendor. Now, if we want to add other contractors to this list, we can. If we want to prepare the 1099s, there will pop up a wizard, and there's different steps that you have to go through. And once you walk through these steps, you'll then be able to get to a report. You'll get to be able to potentially e-file them. But this is something to look for within this section, where you want to make sure you're going to, oops, where you want to make sure that under payroll you have your contractors and you have them specifically listed as 1099 recipients. So, and the software, the QuickBooks Online does have the 1099 NEC version in their software, so that we're good with that. So then let's go to the next section where we have tips and tricks. We have a wide range of items that we wanted to cover in this section. Because I don't see any questions within the chat, we will continue on with this section. If you have any questions, then go ahead and pop them in there and we'll see if we can answer them. But the first thing we wanted to talk about was going back to these account and settings, because as I mentioned early on, a lot of times you want to make sure your QuickBooks is set up, you're using it properly, and that you have the proper features enabled in order to run your business efficiently, make your day-to-day transactions work for you. And one thing to notice is there's a wide range of information. You have to have your, this is all the heading information on reports. So you may want to make sure that this information is correct, as well as if you're filing payroll reports from here or the 1099s, you want to make sure that that information is correct. And then under advanced, we were here previously with the accounting and the closing of the books, and we entered a closing date. But there's also different things here where you have the chart of accounts, and you could enable account numbers if you want. You can track classes and locations here. So different things that you can turn on and off. And this would be the place that you would want to make sure that you review. And maybe after you've utilized QuickBooks for a while, you want to go back and you want to re-review these items, because maybe there's something in here that you didn't realize that you had the capabilities of doing. And if you turn it on, then you can then use those capabilities. Like the class tracking or the location tracking. If we turn this class tracking on, what happens is you can have the option of warning for transactions. So in our journal entries, there would be another item that you'd want to make sure you have entered in order to create that journal entry or that check, that bill, that invoice, so that you track the items by class. Then you could get reports by classes. We don't have any classes entered here, but you could have it warn you, or if you don't want it and you just kind of want to see what it looks like, you don't have to have it warn you about entering those transactions. The locations is also another option here, and they do have some pre-filled location labels listed. If you want to do different locations by business or departments, things of that nature, those are listed here. And again, you can turn them off and on at any point in time. They aren't a specific, once you have them on, you have to utilize them always. But it's good that if you turn on class tracking, that you want to use it to get, and you want to use it on every transaction in order to get proper reporting. And in doing so, you would want to have the warn me when a transaction isn't assigned, because otherwise that just doesn't make sense for you to kind of put it on but not really use it. And they do have two options here. One to so that you have a class per row in. So when you have a journal entry, you'd need to enter a class for each row, which might work because you may have a journal entry, a transaction that you might need to detail out the payroll into different classes for different somebody works and they might work different classes throughout the same week, versus having one row for each, for the entire transaction. That would be that if you have a journal entry, you would enter that class tracking for the whole journal entry. So therefore, if you had a payroll and you needed to break it out by class, you would have to enter a different payroll entry for each class. So if we mark this as to each row in a transaction, and we click Save, and we go to a journal entry, we see that class is listed here now. So we'd have to create classes and enter them. But if we go back to our account and settings, and we go to our class tracking, and we say 1 to the entire transaction, and we save. And we let it think through its thing, and we go to back to a transaction. We wouldn't need, we would only need one. It's still listed here, but we would only need one class for the whole transaction. It'll duplicate it all the way down. We wouldn't need it entered in each section. So now, oh yeah, I want to leave without saving. So that is some class things again in this account and settings where we want to make sure that we're looking at some of the different types of information that we're using throughout the time, and something that you might want to check and verify. If you do set up some of those memorized transactions, you might want to set up the reminders. If you don't have them automatically entered, that will give you a reminder as well. So then let's go to another thing that we might want to set up is managing users. We might want to set up different users that have different restrictions within QuickBooks. Why would that be? Well, you might have one person that you want to enter certain transactions, or somebody who you just want to have them have the ability to look at the QuickBooks but not enter any transactions or modify anything. So therefore, you can set up different users in the QuickBooks, and you have to first select if they're going to be standard user, where you can give them full or limited access without admin privileges, or you have a company administrator. You typically, the company administrator, you might have 1 or 2 of these people, because they could add the users, they can do everything within the QuickBooks without limitation. But as it mentions here, not everyone should be an admin, because you do possibly have those users that you want to have limited access to. So you have a standard user that you want to set up. And maybe you want them just to, they can see all the reports. And so then you have these types of users here as well, where you have somebody who just has the report users, or maybe they can add their own timesheets, but nothing else. They can't see, they're limited to see everything else. This works when you have those employees that you want them to enter their time, and this gives them the limited access to the rest of the QuickBooks features. But let's just go with a standard user to see what features you can limit them to. So obviously you can give them all access here, or you can give them no access to the accounting feature, or you can give them limited access based on customers and vendors. Maybe they're going to be only doing invoicing. So if you have, they can, here it lists, they can do these types of transactions, but they can't do these types of transactions. So if they're limited to the customers, they can enter your invoices and everything, but they aren't able to view the bank registers. They're not able to, but they can still receive payments against those invoices and do those types of transactions. And if you have them limited to vendors, again, they can enter the vendor bills, they can print checks, again, except for refunds. And so you can see what specific items that they're limited to. And then it continues on and asks various questions. Do they need to submit their own timesheets? You select their name. Let's just say no here. But then there's different, continues on to, can they add different users? Do you want them obviously to edit the company information? Again, that would be only the administrator or managing the subscriptions. These are things that probably only the administrator would be able to do. So you'd want to say no. And then lastly, you have to enter a name for them. So let's just, and you need to make sure that you enter a name here and an actual email address. Otherwise, it will not allow you, you can't just put in any email address. It has to be an actual, an email address. I don't know if this one's right, but see, it won't allow you to continue without an email address because it's a QuickBooks Online. So we're not going to continue with this, but you can see how then you can have your list of users here and then you can modify them. Again, this limits the amount of information a specific user can do. That way they can't maybe add any invoices, delete any invoices if you have that type of limitation to them. When we're in transactions, sometimes we're in a transaction and the recent transactions just doesn't show us everything we want to see. So we might want to search for specific transactions or dollar amounts. So here gives us the recent transactions that we've done throughout, not necessarily today, but then if we go to this advanced feature, we have different things we can look at. Is it a journal entry? Are we searching for all transaction lines? Maybe we're looking for a specific dollar amount. If we type in 100 and we search, amount, sorry. If I would type in the right thing and I need to type in a dollar, we see that $100 appeared in a few different transactions here. Some of these were transactions we did today. Some were created previously. And if you click on that transaction, you can then go to that and find that transaction specifically. So this is one way to search items. There's different filters that you can add. When you're doing these, again, there's multiple things you can look for if you know a specific name in here, what type of transaction. So typically I say all transactions, but then you have where you can do an amount or it's a name. So if we know that it's a specific customer that we're looking for, we have this sales receipt, we couldn't find it any other way. That's one thing that we want to make sure we are searching for. Maybe it's that chins that we have. And so we search and we have multiple things that we can look and modify. Now, we can add different types of things that we want to see on this report. We can sort the report. Again, in any of these transactions, we can sort things. Now, what happens if you want to look at this, you search this, but you also want to make sure that you keep this open so that you can look at all the different transactions. Maybe the first one's not the right, and you don't want to keep going back and forth. You could come up here and duplicate this window. You then have multiple windows with the same information. And so then you could search here and also look at the transaction over here as well and compare them. And you can do that with any time frame. Or you can also open another QuickBooks file, the same QuickBooks file, in as long as you use a different browser. Say you're in Chrome and you open up Internet Explorer. Because you have a different web browser, you can open up a new company in there. So then we went through the searching function. We went through a few things there. The next thing that I had was recurring transactions, but that we did discuss already previously when we discussed the journal entries. So I don't think we need to go through that. The class feature is the next tips and tricks item I wanted to go over. That one is available in the QuickBooks Online Plus. I forgot to mention that. And we went through setting that up. And again, once you have it set up, there's different reports. So we'd have to go and set this up. Oh, we have projects in here too. How come I can't see it now? Of course I'm. Oh, here, classing. So we have this set up, but then you have various reports that you would be able to generate based on classes. So now I have the profit and loss by class, but because I don't have any classes and transactions to those specific classes, it's not going to benefit me. But you would have, this would be, you know, this is not specified because there is no classes in here. If I went in here and created different classes for a few of these transactions, then I would see different columns with my different classes, and anything that I did not have classed to one of those specific classes would show up in this not specified column. Then there are a few other things we wanted to discuss. And those are in your QuickBooks PowerPoint, and it's about security and how you have the QuickBooks Online. There is monitoring of the QuickBooks Online. The data is protected and private. It is automatically backed up for security purposes. And if you wanted more information, there's a link in the PowerPoint presentation for more information about the security. We kind of had a PowerPoint slide on this, but this is a little bit hard for, you know, potentially in your PowerPoint, but it gives you a few things about the security and how secure the QuickBooks Online can be. Now, one thing that when we were in banking, we went through the banking and the rules, but there is this receipts function. Now, with the receipts function, this is a function, it's not working in the sample company because it is a sample company, but you can upload. The neat thing about this feature is that you could upload bills or receipts, and then QuickBooks would create the transaction for you. You may have to categorize the transaction as to what kind of expense it goes into, but you save the time of actually creating the transaction. So you could, if you have a PDF of it on your computer, you could upload it from your computer here. So you would click on it and then select where exactly this transaction is. But make note, you'd want to make sure that you're doing this with one receipt or bill per upload. So you may have to do it multiple times. You can't just have a file, a PDF that has 12 different receipts as one PDF. That will not work. So you could have it on your computer already. You could have it in the Google Drive. There is a function where you can email it to QuickBooks. And what happens here is you create a QuickBooks email account, and you set up certain users that then email, and you tell them which users are able to email receipts to this email account. You then are able to just send an email to that specific account, and it will populate here, and then they will populate down here. The last one is if you have, and you download the QuickBooks app on your phone, you could snap a picture of the receipt or the bill, and then it will populate here as well. Again, this feature is not working, but we can discuss it, and you can see if it interests you to move forward with something like this. So then what happens is kind of like the banking rules, where there are the transactions show up listed here for your review, and then you can categorize those expenses. You can decide if you want to keep them, delete them, and once you've reviewed them and accepted them, then they get put into the QuickBooks transactions. So then you create the transaction into QuickBooks. Again, you then have the banking rules where you can download the transaction as well. But with this function, the QuickBooks will create the transaction for you. And it kind of starts the transaction. So it kind of gives you a little assistance with that feature. Now there is another way that you could, if you have a journal entry or a bill or an invoice, and you want to attach something that's already in your computer, you could click on this attach. It would then go out. Again, if you have a PDF, these are certain PDFs, JPEGs, things of that nature. You could then attach it to this journal entry. You could attach it to invoices, bills, anything of that nature, and it will be in there as well. That's after you've created the transaction. You add the backup PDF to it. Here, QuickBooks is starting the transaction for you. You upload that receipt or that bill, and then it starts the transaction for you. Gives you a head start. Then another thing we wanted to talk about was the third-party applications. That is one of the last few items that I wanted to discuss. Here is that there are many third-party applications that do work well with the QuickBooks Online version. And when doing so, different ways you can do this. In this sample company, I don't have the option to select the applications, but when you start your QuickBooks feature, you do have on the left-hand side, there is an option that says apps. And so therefore, you can look for free applications in there, editor picks, or popular applications. And some of those items are like a bill.com or a Veeam, where it'll assist you with the billing portion. There might be CRM applications or inventory applications that work with QuickBooks. And so might be a good place to start if there's something that you're limited in QuickBooks and you want to explore different options for an add-on for QuickBooks. Now, as I mentioned, there are different ways to, as I'm just doing some of the last minute things here, there are different ways to get two different things in your QuickBooks there's all of these different menu items on the side. But if you have the dashboard open, you also have these different ways to get to, you could set up your payments, send your invoices. You can click on these bank accounts and go directly to the banking section. So there's different ways to get to transactions. If you wanted to go down, you have graphs you can do, reports. So there's all, so it's worth exploring some of the other options in QuickBooks. And we didn't cover everything here, but there's a potential for a wide range of items, and hopefully you guys picked up on a few tips, something that you might want to research further or get more information on. So I don't know if there's any questions on anything that is for the QuickBooks Online. I know we didn't go through invoices or vendors, but that would be for another time frame. We didn't go into in depth in some areas. So I don't
Hi, Mary,
see
can you hear me?
Hello?
Yeah, this is Carl. Can you hear me, Mary?
Yes, I can.
All right, I have a question on invoicing. I know you didn't get into invoicing, but
Sure.
and it may be down into the weeds too far for the group, but my company owns assisted living centers, and some of my customers get an invoice at the beginning of every month. And so I send an invoice from a particular assisted living center, and so it has a name, and so I want that name to appear on the invoice. And so QuickBooks has this feature where you can customize invoices. But for some reason, the name of the facility does not stick in the company name field of that invoice. So I'll do all my invoices for one facility, and I'll put the facility name in there, and then I'll do my invoices for my other facility, and I've got to reinsert that name. And then at the end of that process, I'll go to this page, which you just put. You're showing this page. It says the company name.
Yeah.
And it should have the company name in there. And what QuickBooks does for me, it changes the company name to the facility, the last facility name that I've been using, and it drives me crazy every month. So I will consider this a good investment of the fees today, if you can solve that problem for me.
Well, I actually haven't. I haven't actually come across that because yeah, this is the name that would appear on your reporting and on your invoicing, and so I could look into that. I would have to look into that and get back to you. I certainly can. So if you just want to send me an email, the last page of the PowerPoint has my email address. I certainly can ask around, because I have not had anybody have a different name they wanted on an invoice. So I can't say that I haven't had that happen for the customizing of different invoices.
Okay, I'll shoot you an email and explain that, and you can ask around the water cooler if that's
yeah, and
anybody's.
I certainly can look into it and get back to you. That works great. Okay. But yeah, that's one thing that when you're using this, and this would be the company name that it would pull for most items, and therefore you'd want to make sure this is correct. And in your case, you want different names. So I'm not sure how those different names will appear and if you can do that, but I will look into that and get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. I don't know if there's anybody else that has any other questions. Otherwise, we will call it a day.